Thank you very much, everybody, for coming. Sorry we're starting a tiny bit late. So we're here to discuss today the future and the financing of the Belt and Road in Africa. Everybody has heard about the Belt and Road now. Not everybody, I think, knows exactly what it is. But we have a wonderful panel to discuss the implications of what has been called a $10 trillion package. So $10 trillion. My name's David Pilling. I'm the Africa editor of the Financial Times. I was in Asia for 14 years, actually based in Hong Kong for a lot of that time, and so became quite familiar with China. So for what it's worth, I've sort of seen this from both sides, and I think as have many of our panelists. The room's packed. I think there's another 200 people watching online. For anybody who wants to tweet about this, if the urge strikes you, it's hashtag China Africa. I think we were up all night thinking about that one. So I'll introduce the panelists probably, I think, one by one as we, as I sort of call them up. I just wanted to make a few sort of very basic opening remarks myself. First of all, the Belt and Road, I think, is very much a kind of a catch-all phrase. I remember talking to some Chinese officials, this was maybe about a decade ago now, or just about when Belt and Road was being launched, and they were going to present something about Chinese investment in the Philippines, I think, and they had to change all the slides at the last minute and put Belt and Road on the top, because basically, Belt and Road became this way of forming a strategy around what was and has been happening for many years, which started out, I suppose, as early as, you could trace it back a long way, but you could trace it back to around 2000 when China became a net importer of oil, when it became very hungry for all sorts of resources. And when it became much more ambitious as well, and instead of all roads leading to Washington or London or Paris, there was an ambition, I think, for at least some roads to lead to Beijing. Again, I think different panelists will have different views. It's important to realize that, as well organized as China is and can seem, it's not monolithic, and there isn't, as much as people think, I think, a kind of a China Inc. There's no guy in a room somewhere devising China-Africa policy. Although I personally do think that China has kind of seen, whatever China is, the Chinese leadership has seen in Africa a sort of a diplomatic and economic and a commercial opportunity that, to some extent, the rest of the world had been ignoring. And I think that's why we've seen China, Chinese companies, official China, private China, Chinese citizens moving into what had been not exactly a vacuum, but certainly a kind of a space. I probably, again, in line, I guess, with some of the panelists, I've always thought of the Chinese influence in Africa as net positive. Now, it doesn't mean that everything that Chinese companies do in each of 54 countries is always good. How could it possibly be? But the idea, and we've heard a lot of the rhetoric coming out of Washington in recent years and even in recent months. This idea that China is this kind of bogeyman trying to capture Africa, trying to ensnare it in debt. Trying to suck out all its resources, a kind of a neo-colonialist project, I think is hugely overdone. Like a lot of these things, there may be elements of truth in what's said, but I think that in giving African governments a choice, giving them access to finance, giving them access to infrastructure, which had not really been built in the years before China came in a big way, has, as I say again, been, in my opinion anyway, a net positive. the final point I'd like to make is that we tend to talk, and I've just done it myself, which is why I want to redress it. We tend to talk about Africa in terms of, first of all, we need to be very careful if we talk about Africa, because of course we're talking about 54 different countries. But we tend to talk about it as a continent to which things are done. The scramble for Africa, the new scramble for Africa, what does China want in Africa, what does the US want, etc. That is the wrong way of looking at things very often, and we need to remember that that African countries, African governments, African civil society, businesses have agency here. And personally, I think the next stage, in a sense, is for governments to use that agency more creatively, and to become more strategic about their dealings, not only with China, but with many other countries who have followed China, the Turkeys and the Indias and the Brazils and the Gulf states of this world, and ensure that their dealings with the rest of the world are positive for the citizenry of their countries, and not the leadership of their countries. Anyway, I think that's definitely enough from me. I would like to start with Dr. Yoon Jung Park, who I'm delighted is here. I'm just going to check her biography just to make sure I don't get anything wrong. She's a renowned scholar in this growing field of China-African studies. She's the author of A Matter of Honor, Being Chinese in South Africa. Her research has focused on ethnic Chinese in Southern Africa and perceptions of Chinese people by local communities. She looks at this from the perspective of a sociologist, but today, just for us, she's going to put on her financial hat. She's going to talk about lending practices from Chinese stakeholders, specifically with regard to the Belt and Road project.
Thanks, David.
Thank you.
I'm a replacement for Professor Deborah Bradegum, who sends her apologies. She couldn't be here. She is one of the most renowned researchers of Chinese lending to Africa, and I'm going to speak based on her research, but also the research of the China-Africa Research Initiative, where I've been based for the last year. The China-Africa Research Initiative collects data on Chinese loans to Africa, and I'll be speaking to that. So let me go ahead and start. Guinea was actually China's first African borrower. In 1960, Beijing offered Guinea a $25 million line of credit, interest-free. This finance was used to construct a cigarette and match factory, a tea plantation and factory, a conference center, and a small hydroelectric station. Nearly 60 years have passed between that first loan from China to Africa, but it's only recently, in the last several years, that Chinese lending has received so much public attention. Chinese lending has been funding Africa's infrastructure projects long before the Belt and Road Initiative existed. And this is one of my first points. I've revisited a few times. In addition to Guinea's hydropower plants and the well-known Tanzania-Zambia Railway, which was completed in 1976, China funded hydropower plants in the Congo in 1980 and Sierra Leone in 1986, water supply projects in Mauritania in 87, and the Republic of Congo in 1990, roads in Ethiopia, the Luapula Bridge in Zambia, and many, many more. The connection between the announcement of the Belt and Road Initiative in 2013, since then, 37 African countries have signed the BRI Memorandum of Understanding. 28 of these were signed during the 2018 Forum on China-Africa Cooperation gathering. The connection between African Belt and Road signatories and Chinese loans to these countries, based on our research, is actually quite weak. In other words, there's not a lot of evidence of a causal connection between the Belt and Road Initiative and Chinese lending to Africa. When Angola is excluded, lending totals, while high, have been pretty constant since the Belt and Road Initiative's unveiling. In other words, the announcement of BRI has not had a positive impact on Chinese lending for African transport infrastructure development. And surprisingly, the lending for transport infrastructure actually dropped in the period between 2014 and 2015. In 2014, Kenya signed 2 loans for the standard gauge railroad for a total of 3.6 billion US. So that is kind of one of the biggest chunks of Chinese lending to Africa that kind of falls under BRI. South Africa and Egypt were 2 of the earliest BRI signatories, and lending has increased to these countries since 2013. But is that BRI? We're not sure. Again, it's the question of making these causal linkages that the media tends to do quite frequently. Everyone seems to point to Djibouti in particular as a BRI country. In fact, they didn't formally sign the BRI MOU or anything until the FOCAC 2018. So just a note there to remember. This was probably going to come up in the question, so I thought I'd go ahead and nip it in the bud. The primary concern of late around China's lending to Africa and Chinese lending globally has been around debt traps, or what has been called debt trap diplomacy, and Africa's debt sustainabilities. What Deborah Bradegam wrote in her New York Times opinion piece was the following: yes, debt is on the rise in the developing world, and Chinese overseas lending is, for the first time, a part of that story. But there is scant evidence of a pattern of Chinese banks deliberately over-lending or funding loss-making projects to secure strategic advantages for China. In response to all of these headlines about debt trap diplomacy, CARI, the China-Africa Research Initiative, created debt profiles for the 17 low-income African countries that are already in or at risk of debt distress. Our findings fell into 3 categories. So the first group of 8 countries, which included Burundi, Cape Verde, the Central African Republic, Chad, the Gambia, Mauritania, São Tomé and Príncipe, and South Sudan. In these 8 countries, Chinese loans were a relatively small share of debt. The major factor for debt distress in these countries was either conflict-related economic collapse, commodity price collapse, or some other economic management factor internal to that country. The second group of countries that included Cameroon, Ethiopia, Ghana, Mozambique, Sudan, and Zambia. China was a more significant creditor, but each of those countries had also borrowed significantly from other sources. In those countries, Chinese loans ranged from 25 to 50% of debt. Only in 3 countries, Djibouti, the Republic of Congo, and Zambia, did we find that China is, quote unquote, responsible for debt sustainability issues in those countries. Is China deliberately trying to entrap Africa in debt to get their natural resources? The answer is that China learned themselves from receiving loans from Japan back in the day and benefited from them. So it might be intuitive for China to use the same strategy for infrastructure projects, even though this might not be best suited for Africa. Are Chinese loans usurious? In other words, are they lending at super high rates? Chinese concessional loans are actually cheaper than market rate loans, but actually not as nice as those from the World Bank or the IMF. The issue here is that the World Bank and IMF's loan sizes and loan purposes simply don't match the needs of many African projects, specifically for large infrastructure projects. IMF and World Bank may have really low interest rates for their loans, but the loan sizes are usually much smaller and, again, don't fund large infrastructure projects. Do I have a couple minutes? Or am I...
Yeah, I'm also going to ask a couple of questions which will kind of play off what you're saying, but yeah, absolutely.
I just wanted to touch briefly on debt relief and debt cancellation because this is an area that the China-Africa Research Initiative has just started to work on. It's still preliminary, but at the start of the debt crisis, China was the first responded by providing debt relief by rescheduling payment terms. For example, going back to the Tanzania-Zambia Railway, payments were postponed for 10 years because after the first loan was given, the debt crisis, the first one, began. And China very kindly just suspended those payments for 10 years. By the end of 2012, Chinese had announced that they had canceled African overdue zero-interest loan debt worth approximately 3.27 billion. More recently, in the wake of the Belt and Road Initiative Forum, which was held in Beijing this spring, Ethiopia received another cancellation on all of its interest-free loans up to the end of 2018, and this was on top of already earlier renegotiated extensions. One of our researchers, Yunnan Chen, has argued that these sorts of concessions highlight both the continuing debt struggles that governments have taken on in large infrastructure projects, but they also highlight the advantages and flexibility of Chinese loans.
So a couple of follow-up questions. So one is, if you look at, say, the International Monetary Fund in the 80s and 90s, when they were lending to Africa, then there was a default, and then there was, the IMF moved in with its structural adjustment programs, forced all sorts of policy changes throughout the continent. If you'd have sat down and asked anybody at the IMF, is this a deliberate policy to force Africa? They would have said no. So my question is, does it matter? Does it matter whether China thinks it's engaging in debt trap diplomacy if, Djibouti and Angola and Zambia are borrowing too much and they're going to get into trouble? Isn't that the point?
I think part of this has to do with Chinese own experience with development, and I think with current African governments' priorities in infrastructure development. And again, if I kind of turn it back around to one of the things that you said, some of these questions are asked in a way that assume that African governments aren't making these decisions on their own, as if China is forcing these loans down their throats. And I think that's an unhelpful and unfair way to characterize the situation. But unfortunately, in most of the West, and I'm based in Washington, D.C. right now, that has been the tone and the tenor of the conversations, that that China is doing something to Africa. And I'm sure Ambassador will speak to this just now, but African governments, African leaders are making these decisions, and the infrastructure projects and the debt that they're taking on are things that they want, that they realize they need in order to reach that next level of development.
Right. And then second, very quickly, given that you were saying that there's such little correlation between Belt and Road initiatives and the money that actually flows, I mean, is it useful at all to think about, or to even talk about the Belt and Road initiative when it comes to Africa? Why don't we just talk about Chinese projects in Africa?
Yeah, no, frankly, as an academic, I find it incredibly unhelpful to talk about the Belt and Road initiative.
So we're changing the title
it's
of
a
the
huge umbrella, a basket. I've heard it called. It's a convenient kind of overall strategy for China to use.
Okay.
And it wasn't called the BRI initially. It was One Belt, One Road. And so if you read some of the literature from several years back, they all refer to OBOR. Yep. But this is just the latest naming of things that are happening. Right? There is Chinese lending for infrastructure.
You're right. My story was about OBOR, not about BRI. Yeah, indeed. Let's turn to the ambassador from Ethiopia, Faseha Shawel Gebre. I hope I pronounced that roughly right. So the ambassador is fairly new to London. Right. Joined the Ethiopian Ministry of Foreign Affairs in 1990s. Career diplomat, served in various diplomatic missions: South Sudan, Kenya, Somalia, Egypt. Vast experience in between. His Excellency was assigned various posts within the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, including as Deputy Chief of Cabinet, Chief Advisor on the Intergovernmental Authority on Development, and the Deputy Head of the Somalia Office. So vast experience there.
Thank you.
How does this look to you?
So marvelous. It enabled me now in front of you to talk.
How does the whole question of the China Belt and Road, of China's involvement in Africa, appear from the perspective of Ethiopia?
Yeah, thank you very much. Ethiopia, as you know, in the Horn of Africa, is now over 100 million plus people. And already before our strong relationship with China, my government, since the 1990s, was very clear that unless we democratize, unless we push economic development, and unless we bring peace and stability, with the increasing population pressure, that we had no future. That was very clear. So before China coming into the scene, we were trying hard first to develop infrastructure and then to build manufacturing industries in Ethiopia. Then this was especially has got intensive, got the necessary focus and intensive drive and hard work came since 2005, 2006. And then when Belt and Road came in BRI around 2013, 2014, what we in Ethiopia did was to reposition our economic outlook, prospects with China. Otherwise, it was a process going on already, and it came, it required us just to complement with what China has come. This Belt and Road initiative, as you know, focuses mainly in Horn of Africa up to Cairo at the moment, including Kenya. And in this Ethiopia, when I say we were repositioning ourselves, so we try to align our activities with expanding telecom activities, expanding rail and road highways, expanding our Ethiopian Airlines reach out, connecting 48 African cities with the outside world, and now currently flying more than 35 flights a week to China in 5 major provinces that are the key states for the Belt and Road Initiative. And along this line, what we did was our maritime agency was trying to expand again with Chinese assistance, which we own more than 10 ships built by China, and now accessing Chinese ports more than 48. So you can see how it is linked with this initiative of China. Overall, in Africa, the Chinese gesture was overwhelmingly welcomed. I attended the 2015 summit of FOCAC in South Africa, and previously China-Africa cooperation we hosted in Addis Ababa. And the leadership both in Ethiopia and the rest of Africa, we welcomed it. Though it is focused in East Africa and North Africa, but there are other activities alongside this in the continent. One is that we have recently made operational the African Economic Trade Zone, Free Trade Zone, and also Africa's, through African Union, our 2063 initiative. And in all this, Africa, what suffered most was lack of infrastructure. We could not do business between ourselves, we could not trade, and we could not trade with other countries because of this problem. So the involvement of China with Ethiopia and the rest of Africa focused on infrastructure and building industrial bases, while the West is active on the mining sector. So it is basically complementary. If we see now Ethiopian economy, well connected with UK, Europe, and America, but the basis of the economy moving to manufacturing sector and also infrastructure and banking sector, well connected with other continents. So we feel in Africa that the initiative of China, yes, it can be argued in whichever way, whether it is helpful or it has got its own backdraws, but we welcomed it simply because the basis of cooperation, I can speak certainly for Ethiopia, the offer is a willing buyer, a willing seller. We wish to do it, and China is willing to do it. So it is up to us to reposition ourselves, how to maximize on this offer. And we feel in Ethiopia that, for example, we are planning to be manufacturing base in Africa, which we built the last 1 decade, about 13 industrial parks, which are all of them full now. There is no space. And who is occupying this with the Chinese support? These industrial parks, Koreans, Indians, UK, Turkish, and the Gulf. So we are seeing that what China is doing is also attractive to others. Also, it is interconnecting us. So it is really complementary. And this is what we are doing, but as the title indicates, it has got its own problems. One is we in Africa, including my country, we have to work more on corruption. Chinese projects must be made public, and the private investigation and the follow-up and transparency. That is our part that we have to do. Second is security within the continent. If you see my region, Horn of Africa, we have Somalia struggling to come out from long failure. South Sudan with such a problem. Eritrea coming out in peace with Ethiopia and to become at peace with itself. And Sudan in transition. And Kenya, Uganda, every time they have elections, there is always issues that we in Africa are suffering from this chronic security problem that we have to improve on this. This is one element that would be a problem to maximize the benefits from China. The other one is views of China and the West are not complementary. What we are hearing always is what China is doing is always contradicted by the West, and which is not appropriate. That we have to agree that it is helpful. The other one is lack of existing infrastructure within the continent itself. For trade and investment, we have to do more, like road, railway, telecom, energy, power grids. We have to interconnect ourselves. And there is a huge deficit at balance of trade with China, that we know. That we have to have a mechanism to narrow it a little bit. Otherwise, net beneficiary and net loser wouldn't help into win-win situation. That is another area that we need to work. And very high cost of trade within Africa itself. And as the saying goes, if you do business in Europe or America or Asia, it is just 100% more expensive to do business in Africa. Then that we have to do something on that also. And BRI itself and the Chinese initiative itself is in constant move. It is under constant evolution. It is being adjusted so that we continue. Ethiopia would be at the center of China's approach to Africa, but others are also looking into how to fit in. So we appreciate the Chinese side would be more clearer, more firm, and more clear roadmap ahead of us. Otherwise, the opportunity is welcome to my successive governments and my leadership, and we are very happy on where we are now. Thank you.
Thank you. That was a fascinating roundup, I think, of your interactions with China. Two quick follow-ups. You mentioned the phrase willing buyer, willing seller.
Yes.
Are you pleased that you bought the Djibouti to Addis railway? I mean, one hears of teething problems, power shortages, underutilization. Is that working, and what have you learned from that particular project?
Yeah, it has got a little ups and downs, but the improvement is impressive. From Djibouti, through the eastern city of Dawa to Djibouti from Addis Ababa, we used to take 3 days or 4 days for a cargo to reach the port. Our outlet is Djibouti port to the sea. And it used to take us 4 days, 3 days. Now, with the Chinese electric rail from Addis Ababa to Djibouti, less than 12 hours we are at the port. But electricity shortage has nothing to do with China. It is Ethiopia's problem that we have to improve. And for this, we have the Great Renaissance Dam, which is on the Nile, that will produce 6,000 megawatts per year, which is enough to half of Africa, which we are planning to export to Djibouti, Sudan, Kenya, and the rest of South Sudan, so that we can provide electricity connectivity to the Horn of Africa and the greater Eastern Africa. Otherwise, China was aware of this need of electrification that they have done in the north with Takaze Dam. They have financed it and it's already operational. And Gilgal Gibe at the border with Kenya, we are also completing the third round, the tertiary program. So with the completion of other hydro power projects, we will soon overcome electricity shortage. Not because we do it for the railway, but for the entire people of Ethiopia, that we need electrification for everything. It is the basis. That's why we are just doing much. And by next year, I hope we will not be talking about shortage of electricity.
Right.
That's where we are.
Second question. Since Abiy Ahmed has come into power, there's a lot of discussion about liberalizing the economy. You know, what it had been under Meles Zenawi, a kind of a command economy, you know, deliberately sort of copying some of the models that we'd seen in successful models that we'd seen in Asia.
Yeah.
We're now tweaking that model. Will you, as a result, be recalibrating, do you think, your relationship with China?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. Some try to read too much into Dr. Abiy's reform programs on the economy. But we are liberalizing both the politics and the economy of Ethiopia. It is in this century and at this time, it is not plausible to continue with large state-held corporations, and simply because we cannot be competitive. So it is selective liberalization that we are doing, open to everybody, including UK businesses are competing, and China is also competing alongside with other partners. So liberalizing the economy is a must in Ethiopia.
Okay.
Otherwise, we cannot continue this way, and it will be done, the procurement and the bidding services procedures are according to international practices, and it's being done openly. So that's a must we have to do.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
That was very, very interesting. Next speaker is Ginny Yan. Ginny joined the ICBC Standard Bank as Chief China Economist in 2016 and leads the China market strategy and the research team. Her focus is to deliver China macroeconomic and market insights to internal and external stakeholders, and today we are those external stakeholders, I guess. So we're lucky enough to get the benefit of her expertise.
Thank you very much, David. First of all, I'm delighted to be here. And given that the topic is China-Africa and we're ICBC Standard, so ICBC Chinese Bank and Standard Bank, obviously one of the biggest African banks, I think the topic is very interesting, regardless of what the title is, whether it's Belt and Road or not. Is completely irrelevant, because as long as there's a China angle, it is Belt and Road with that regard. And I am very delighted to hear some of the remarks already made by the two previous speakers. In particular, I think 2 points. Number one, about connectivity. Belt and Road for me is all about connectivity. So we conducted some research on Belt and Road, looking at it from a very much a macroeconomic angle. We like to remove the politics away from Belt and Road, because from but for us, it's really about economic growth, how to boost global economic growth through infrastructure investment. But that was the original version, infrastructure very much being the dominant part of it. But I will go on to talk about how that future angle is coming in. What is the future development for Belt and Road? So economic growth comes from not only trade connectivity, but also investment. And third, and most people really do not to pay too much attention on the people angle as well, the people connectivity. And for me, whether you're looking at Africa, whether you're looking at Central Asia, and in fact, Belt and Road started in Central Asia. I think Central Asia as a region is the only area where per capita investment in infrastructure is even lower than the continent of Africa, I believe. So Kazakhstan's where it rolled out, and obviously the reason why Belt and Road put a lot of, well, over 140 now Belt and Road, signatories, I guess, not only countries but also international organizations as well. The reason why there's a commonality between all of these countries is that they are in need of infrastructure, not only infrastructure, but some sort of momentum for further growth, future growth, other diversification of sectors. So coming back to Africa, I just wanted to touch on maybe three things. What is Belt and Road? I already touched on. Actually, no one has that answer because, as we've also touched on, it's constantly evolving. Whoever has an answer to what is Belt and Road obviously comes from a very specific angle. If you're a person in development, you would be talking about capacity building. If you're in banking, you'd be talking about the bankability of Belt and Road projects. So completely depending on what your intention is when you're trying to understand Belt and Road. And then how? So I talked about, Belt and Road, trade, investment, people. Why people is important? So we all understand that most of the trade connectivity is bringing economic growth. Investment also, we've talked about these, whether it's outbound direct investment. And in fact, outbound investment from China has really come down in recent years. If you added together all the sort of data from 2013 to 2017, which is the latest official data from MOFCOM, you'll come to something like 17 billion, and that's absolutely nothing. We, as part of our research, we counted roughly 120 billion worth of projects that not only China has really committed to, but also is including things like M&A, mergers and acquisitions, equity investment, and things like that. And people don't tend to have a concept of overall data for that. But that said, that 120 billion could be projects over a tenor of, say, 10 years, 20 years down the line. So you can't account for it in 1 year's data. And that's why it's so difficult to really account for how much projects are already out there on Belt and Road. And then coming to people, tourism, not just tourism, all of the education programs set up by China, but together with other countries, research programs that's now related to Belt and Road. I know here we're sitting, talking about it. The very fact that much research has been activated to understand what is necessary to really to gauge that is very interesting. And that's all part of connectivity. This is what the ambassador talked about. Now, how has it shifted? Many people would probably mark this April, so Belt and Road, the second Belt and Road Forum in Beijing, as kind of Belt and Road 2.0. I would argue there's been many, many versions of Belt and Road simply because China likes to learn from previous mistakes, and China does cross the road by groping the stones because China can really do things by its own experience. And much of Belt and Road financing has really been based on China's investment in Africa. In fact, as Dr. Park said, it's one of the first loans, etc., were in Africa. But in many of the different jurisdictions that we're operating on, you can't treat it like Africa. because simply you've also got developed markets now, Italy being one of them. Even many countries across Europe are part of the Belt and Road itself. So learning the process of how to adapt to different jurisdictions, actually operating with multiple jurisdictions, because some of these infrastructure projects not only are in two countries, multiple countries. From a legal perspective, risk management perspective, how do you deal with that? That's when the kind of third-party consultants, etc., come in to help. Now, in terms of sectors, as part of our research, we definitely counted, a lot of projects relating mostly to transport, utilities, construction, and in fact, in Africa, most of those projects are in construction. And that's now shifting. If you look at the most recent projects that are being struck between China and particularly African economies, these are now in sectors such as renewable energy, in sectors such as, the digital Silk Road, I would call it. And this is something that also is very difficult to account for. The project sizes sometimes are tiny. And the way that it's being financed, less and less dominant and really dependency on loans, bank loans, more and more about equity investment. Chinese companies taking an equity stake, not even a majority equity stake, but probably a minority equity stake. But still, this is helping to build infrastructure, the digital infrastructure, and that much needed digital infrastructure. Other sectors, consumer goods, healthcare. And the reason why China, has really taken on this strategy, I think, is because it's no longer about governments mapping out what sectors they'd like to invest in. It's less about government to government striking a deal, more about Chinese corporates looking for areas that they would like to expand on globally. So that's why healthcare, consumer goods, these are what Chinese private sector companies want to develop outside of China. And that's another very interesting angle, I think. And then just lastly, I wanted to touch on from our most recent research, 3Ds I can summarize in terms of Belt and Road, not just in Africa, but actually in all the Belt and Road countries. Deepening, diversifying, and decarbonizing. I think it's very fitting today as all the demonstrations are going on all over the world. China really, in the future, I think, has a huge amount of work to do, obviously, when they want to really portray this Belt and Road being a sort of, initiative rather than a strategy or plan. And the initiative is to make, developing countries to realize that if you start to have a strategy at the beginning of starting some of these projects in the right direction, so considering the ESG components, considering SDG, all of these things are something perhaps you could accelerate, your development by planning ahead and having at the beginning. And that's why China can help a lot of these countries, I think, because China is very much the biggest investor in the green economy, for example. A lot of the projects and particularly the research that China has with a lot of international organizations very much focus on the green economy and sustainable growth. And then just lastly, I just want to conclude, I know I have gone over time. Two other things I heard from my two previous speakers. I think the commonality between China and Africa from a macroeconomic perspective, population growth, urbanization, industrialization. These are commonalities that China is going through with the rest of the world, especially Africa. China is now having an aging population, while most of Africa is still having population growth. Now, while supply chain matters more than ever for China, it is absolutely essential for China to get its, initiatives right in Africa, to have the right sort of, result, because it's all about the people, as I say at the very beginning. Most people have positive attitudes towards China, but if you think about job creation and things that I'm sure we'll touch upon that, the next step will be how to create jobs on the back of these projects. Not only our economies as a whole benefiting, but most importantly, how our local economy is benefiting.
As time's ticking away, I'm just going to ask you one follow-up question, which is about the Continental Free Trade Agreement. I mean, I was reading the other day an assertion, really, that China was better at kind of joined-up infrastructure and infrastructure that crosses borders Do you think that's true, and do you think that that someone in Beijing is thinking about this, how to help ACFA get off the ground and become, something that's implementable?
I think China can probably draw on its own experience, particularly in Asia, obviously, because obviously China has been working with a lot of ASEAN countries in particular on regional free trade agreements. But as China has been, very clear about, in a multi kind of polar world, I guess, multilateral world, what's important is to set certain standards, governance, etc. And I guess this is why things like Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank is in place. It's about reforming current structures and governance, but abiding by international standards, of course. So I think I'm not sure whether China really wants to have an influence on this as such. But of course, if advice is being sought from Chinese policymakers, of course it will be given. But at the moment, as we know, there are many disputes, particularly with Western economies. So I don't know how much advice China could be giving right now.
Thanks very much. If I can move to our fourth speaker, Linda Calabrese. Linda is a development economist, a researcher in the International Economic Development Programme here at the ODI. Her research interests include trade, regional integration, something I was just talking about, private sector investment, industrial policy, economic transformation, as well as China-Africa development issues. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thanks, David. So, as here at ODI, we work a lot on research into policy, and my sort of main interest really is how can African countries benefit from the Belt and Road Initiative. This is what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to raise 3 main points, 3 main areas in which I think the engagement could be improved. So the first point talks about the country's ability to plan for strategic infrastructure that they need, that it's critical to their own development. And I'm going to do that with an example of one case where this has not happened, from one country that I know very well and that I work on a lot, which is Uganda. So Uganda is a country that is sort of small on the China radar, doesn't receive a lot of loans or a lot of investment, but still China is a presence. China is funding a number of hydropower stations to improve Uganda's power generation capacity, a number of industrial zones and agricultural zones to also promote production capacity and so on. So this is sort of like in line with China's general infrastructure policy in Africa, which is about building China's investment policy in Africa, which is about building infrastructure, which is about promoting industrialization. But if one thinks about what is the Chinese government, what is Chinese finance doing in Uganda, the main project that comes to mind is really the expressway that connects the capital city of Kampala to the airport in Entebbe. Now, this is a project that has been put in place to reduce the transit time that takes to go from the city to the airport. It comes with a price tag of $400 million US. This was a loan that was taken from China Exim Bank. But unfortunately, what is not clear is whether this project has any relevance for Uganda's economic development, right? So how does it fit in Uganda's own national development strategies? And no matter how many people I've asked and no matter how much I've looked at it and from which angle I've looked at it, really it's not clear. Now the problem with this is that if a project doesn't support the country's productive capacity, it's that it's very difficult to generate enough revenue to then pay the loan back. And the road itself should be a toll road, but at the moment, fees are not being charged. So even the project itself does not directly generate revenues. So this is not to say that each project needs to raise enough money to repay itself. You can look at it in the broader in the broader picture. But still, an infrastructure investment should be linked to productive capacity. Otherwise, it's sort of really not relevant. And I think this is a challenge that countries such as Uganda are facing. So my first point really is about this sort of strategic thinking of leveraging infrastructure for your own development objectives. Which sectors do you want to develop? Which productive capacity do you want to develop? The second point is actually in line with what Ginny was saying about the fact that a lot of these projects are actually regional in nature. So they are not just in one country, even though they are often we often think about the Uganda project or the Kenya projects, but these are actually very often regional projects by their very own nature. If we're looking at a road, for example, that connects different countries, but also a hydropower station, this has impact on the downstream countries in terms of water flows, right? So there's really a regional discussion that needs to be had. Very often these projects actually change regional dynamics. So if we think about East Africa, for example, again, the famous standard gauge railway that connects the port of Mombasa through the capital city of Kenya and then moving on to Uganda and potentially even farther away. This really has the capacity and the potential to shift equilibrium in the region, in the East African region, because it's going to be easier to import goods in certain countries, so these goods are going to compete with the goods that are produced in these countries. But it's also going to be easier for people to move and to relocate, and so this may cause agglomeration in certain areas, and it may generate more employment in some areas compared to others. So really there's a lot to unpack and to think about. But the way these projects are conceived at the moment and negotiated especially is really bilateral. So the Chinese government negotiates with Kenya and then with Uganda, and then as the project develops and moves to other countries, the negotiations are also taken to the other countries. But there's very little thinking about how this should be done regionally in terms of financing, in terms of impact, and in terms of all the sort of potential consequences of these projects. So this was my second point. My third point is sort of a comparative one. So here at ODI, we are doing some research on the Belt and Road, especially in Asian countries, actually. And as the Belt and Road sort of started as the earlier phases were a sort of Asian connectivity project and a vision for China's neighborhood in a way. There's a lot more of these projects in the Asian region. So I think African countries and African governments, which are interested in learning how to deal with Belt and Road better, could actually learn a lot of lessons. There's two countries in particular that I know a bit better, so I want to highlight lessons from these countries. First one being Myanmar. So Myanmar is a country that has had a rocky start in its sort of relationship with China. But at the moment, they are embarking on this project that's called the China-Myanmar Economic Corridor. So the government of Myanmar has set up a steering committee that's very high level. Top government officials sit on the steering committee, and they look at each project as it comes in. So they scrutinize how it fits in their own plans, and they also look at the price tag. And in several instances, they have actually renegotiated the price tag if they felt that the project was too big for their own country or was too big that they couldn't afford it. And at the moment, what's happening in Myanmar is that all these big infrastructure projects are screened through a mechanism that's common to everyone. So each project needs to be scrutinized through this mechanism, and then a decision is taken on whether this is interesting and this is feasible and it doesn't overlap with other projects, or there's no, areas of conflict with other projects. And it's also possible then to find additional funding that doesn't only come from China, but it's also possible to look for other funders for this project. The second country, which I think is also very interesting, is Cambodia. Because Cambodia has a slightly different approach. They have a very conservative policy in terms of borrowing. So in Cambodia, there's one main government institution that's mandated to deal with all the loans that the government receives, and they only accept deals that are very, very concessional. So they only get the best of the best rates. If it's slightly more expensive than what they think it should be, they don't take it on. So they're really very conservative in their approach to borrowing, and this has been really helpful to them. In discussions with them, we found that they feel this is something that other countries could learn from as well. So these are two very different experiences, but both, I think, offer interesting areas of reflections for countries in Africa that want to make the most of the opportunities offered by the Belt and Road. So just to summarize, 3 main points for African countries that are thinking about how can they make the most out of the Belt and Road. Think strategically about the projects. Think about the projects in a regional perspective. And then the third one, see if there's something you can learn from other countries that have been there before. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's fascinating stuff there. Because we don't have too much time, I'm just going to again limit myself to one
Sure.
question. Then we'll go to Q&A. So I'll be asking questions from the audience. I'm very interested in this question of agency, and you've touched upon that in various ways through this. Why do you think that the elites, and I guess it was the elites in Uganda, decided to build a road to the airport? I mean, is that just because they're fed up of being snarled in traffic?
Yeah.
And does that tell you, because it's a question of who has agency, if it's unaccountable leaders who have been in power for 30 odd years, that's one thing. So who has agency? And how, I suppose, in a sense, which governments do you think are thinking strategically in the way that you would advise?
Yeah, I think, I mean, to me, the governments that are thinking strategically, and I think this emerged a lot from the presentation from Ambassador, actually, Ethiopia is probably in Africa one of these countries that
Absolutely,
I would point to. It's really these governments that have a vision of where do we need to be in 10 and 20 years, and that actually pursue this vision. And to be frank, this has very little to do with China, this has very little to do with Belt and Road, this applies throughout. So if there's a government that has a vision of development for their own country, and especially around the most pressing issues of industrialization in some cases, but also job creation more in general, so beyond industrialization really. These are the countries that are normally better at leveraging this. But it's really not only with Belt and Road then, it's across all sectors.
Okay, I'm going to jump straight in. We've got a bit less time for Q&A than we had planned. So I'm going to ask you, if you have a question, just identify yourself and make the question very brief and to the point, and if possible, direct it to one member of the panel. Who would like to go first? Saw a hand shoot up there at the back. I guess this microphone's going to come. Yeah, the guy in blue there.
Thank you. My name's John Gibb, and I'm retired. I work in development quite a long time. I think, as it's one question, I'm not clear at all what the process is that decides what projects, what programs, what sectors will be funded by the Belt and Road or equivalent. It's not clear to me. Okay, it's maybe not an exact comparison, but generally in the World Bank and the IMF, you know, they engage in this sort of endless policy dialogue with a country and this sort of thing, and out of that there comes some sort of feeling for what they should be majoring in and where they've got the comparative advantage in that. But it seems to me all to be a little bit piecemeal and a bit worrying. Okay. And I think, just finally, therefore, where is ESG on all of this? Because it does seem to be a little bit of an add-on, and of course, I think we're beginning to learn more and more day by day that it's very important. Thank you.
Another question. I've got that one. One here, and then.
Thank you. My name is Tom Miller. I wrote a book about the Belt and Road actually a couple of years ago. I've got a quick comment on what you said about Cambodia, and then a question here. So on Cambodia, you were saying that, you know, they've done a jolly good job of taking very cheap loans. But of course, Cambodia is essentially a client state of China's. So, you know, I don't know whether, you know, that might be good for Cambodia, but it might not be. And my question is there a country in Africa which is close to becoming a Chinese client state? You know, which countries in Africa are lacking sort of autonomy when it comes to their relations with China?
And that was specifically to the ambassador.
Well, I think he's in a good place too. I mean, I don't know, Djibouti, for example, I don't know.
And there was, exactly, this guy here. Actually, it was the guy in front of you, but I'll get to you next time.
Hello, good evening. My name is Chidi Wano. I'm an Army Reservist with the Defense Cultural Specialist Unit. My question relates to, I think it's broadly been covered, but I want to be slightly more specific. And that is, we can say that, you know, China is not trying to lead countries into debt traps, but there is clear evidence, you know, from Sri Lanka and Pakistan that China will take over assets that, you know, when people default. And if we're looking at, this is purely maybe from an African point of view, so maybe this is directed more at the ambassador, that Ethiopia is a good example. There are many bad examples. I can speak from the Nigerian perspective. There's many, many bad examples. So whilst it might not be China's policy, it's clear that this is happening. So what is the strategy from your perspective that, you know, Africa could adopt? Maybe something like having, like there's EU rules, there could be AU rules. Do you think that's something that Ethiopia will be happy to champion using their experiences?
Good questions. So there's a couple for you, Ambassador. So
Yes.
one is on debt traps.
Yes.
We have seen this before. We've seen it in Sri Lanka. I forget the other example. What was the other? Oh, Pakistan. Okay. Are you wary?
No.
Should
First
you not
of
be?
all, if I may, with what my brother said, as to who owns BRI and how this project has
Okay.
come into being, BRI belongs to China. They are the owners. They are the financiers. So they discuss, initiate, and agree with the country, the specific country they would do. For example, we had the LAPSET project, Lamu Port from Kenya to South Sudan and Ethiopia transport operation that would eventually link Ethiopia with Djibouti so that the Horn of Africa will be covered by rail and highway. And this, we had it before, and China came with a BRI. Then we started to make it an integral part of the BRI. And in Ethiopia, we had our own projects to link ourselves up with the neighboring countries. And China coming in with BRI, then we realigned it. That's why I said from the beginning, we are repositioning ourselves. So it is owned by China, but it has to be done mutually. And Chinese client state in Africa, not as such. If I take my country's example, yes, we are benefiting a lot from China, but in the Security Council or United Nations forums or other human rights issues, we are so independent, we not follow China. Whatever they want, if we have to disagree, we do disagree. So as such, there is no clearance. But there is economics, that if you take money, if you are defaulting, that there must be a consequence. So it is we in Africa who are at the receiving end to judicially use what we are getting. If not, other economic measures will apply. And it depends on the terms and conditions you agree with. So very simple for me. Debt, yes, it is a bit worrying. We suffered in Ethiopia ourselves because we took the resources and 100% we didn't use them for their intended purposes. And that's our shortcoming, and we are learning from it. And we share with other African countries to learn from mistakes, but we are adjusting now. That's what I can say.
Okay, client state. Did you want to go there?
No.
Who's the client state? Anybody want to take that one on?
No one.
No one. There's no client states.
No plans.
So, sorry?
Zambia.
Zambia, okay. An answer from the audience, I like it. So I'm going to ask a couple of questions from our cyber audience. So question one is from a Dr. Fred Amonia, Lycia, I'm probably pronouncing that completely wrong. So we talk a lot about finance in the Belt and Road Initiative. However, the real channel is returns. Why don't we look at returns? Why do we always talk about? That's probably one for you. Why don't you just?
Sure. Do you want me to answer that? I think it's a really very important point. Most people talk about finance mainly because so much has been, dependent on loans, But as I said, it's shifting towards equity. It's shifting very much. But what is the return being made on these projects? If you ask any Chinese entity, most of it is probably negative returns. Because first of all, as I talk about, depending on what tenor you're looking at, especially now, first part is always most difficult. You're taking on the most amount of risk at the very beginning, especially if it's kind of government to government type of projects. And that's why, so much of a restructuring going on around now. Lots of loans are being restructured to gain the most out of, the returns. And no one really knows in terms of returns, some of it is not going to be repaid for many, many years down the line. Even in terms of equities, for example, the returns won't be coming in the first year. So a lot of, the considerations around returns is about what do you see in this project in terms of the longer term returns. And that's why the multiplier effect of the Belt and Road is so important. It's not about that particular project itself, but what is the economic gain of all of the other projects in the surrounding areas.
So this is infrastructure as a public good, partly.
Yeah, absolutely. So take a port, for example. A port is just a port by itself. How much economic value it's delivering? Well, to the direct beneficiaries of that port. But then you've got the FDI coming in, foreign direct investment coming in, real estate development. You've also got maybe schooling, healthcare, etc. These are the multiplier or the halo effect, some like to call it.
Yes.
And that is something that is at the moment quite difficult to measure because it's still in its early days. We haven't seen the first phase, into the 6th year really, but haven't seen the kind of multiplier effect really come to fore. So I think that's a really important question and very important to get right for the Chinese authorities, because it's something that needs to be, not just about perception, but about reality. When I think the outside community sees the reality of the benefits of these projects, in reality, that is when, I guess, Belt and Road becomes not only a concept, but more of a reality.
Okay, would you like to?
Yeah, I just wanted to interject a couple quick points. I think when we talk about Chinese lending to African countries, particularly on construction projects, most of it is tied to Chinese construction firms. And one of the benefits that I see that we've talked a lot about in the past is the Chinese construction companies becoming globally competitive, gaining the international experience that they hadn't had before, and kind of being able to take advantage of kind of excess skills, labor from China, and selling that off. The other thing that came up this morning in our workshop about multiple Chinese projects in Africa, some of the ones that the China-Africa Research Initiative was involved with were specifically around technology transfer, capacity building, knowledge sharing. But when we actually interviewed Chinese firms in different African countries, number one, most of them weren't state-owned enterprises. They were run by Chinese migrant entrepreneurs in country, in manufacturing in particular. And what many of them said is, in terms of what is driving them in these countries, it had nothing to do with Chinese state policies at all. BRI had perhaps some sort of signaling effect, but what they were talking about was potential market for their own goods. So I think in terms of the longer term strategies that you're talking about, China's looking at the future, not necessarily next year when the loan's supposed to be repaid.
One of the questions from the floor touched on the sort of environment, or at least ESG, and we have a question here. I mean, to summarize, it basically says, when these projects are being devised, Belt and Road projects, how much emphasis is put on environmental safeguards. I don't know, would you like to have a go at that?
Yeah, I'm happy to say a few words about this, although not necessarily my main area of focus, but in general, my thinking is this has been a learning process for a lot of these projects. So maybe at the start, there's a number of projects that have had concerns, like environmental concerns. And as we proceed, we see that there's an improvement. We see that China is issuing the Chinese government has issued a number of guidelines around greening the Belt and Road and around improving on the environmental standards. So really, it's a learning process on a sort of slightly longer scale that probably we would like, but it's definitely there. And I think, we can see a lot of examples of this.
I promised the guy at the back that we'd come back to him.
Thank you. My name is Frank Tonchemra. I'm a PhD student at the Open University. So I've got a comment, then a question.
Very quick comment.
Then my comment is, I think debt is an unavoidable issue, especially at the early stages of development. I would rather be worried about debt that is accumulative for non-productive uses. For example, borrowing to build a palace or a stadium, etc. That said, then from the Chinese side, do we have some kind of standards or mechanisms to ensure that all those projects that will be funded are bankable and there will be revenues from this project?
We've sort of covered that a bit, but
etc.
What safeguards are there from the Chinese side that these are bankable projects that will, produce a return from which the debts can be paid back?
Well, quite easily, the NDRC, so the state planning agency, basically has to approve every single project that is said to be related to Belt and Road. So there's a very stringent, although it's not released obviously to the public, and that's one of the issues about transparency. Of course, we know, but of course, Chinese authorities also have their reasons for keeping that. So obviously, they do have their own set of criteria, but if you think about how much credit within even domestic China, how much credit is being scrutinized now, because we've talked about debt sustainability in Africa, but even debt sustainability in China itself, the build-up of debt in China, the debt leverage, the deleveraging, that's such a huge problem for China's domestic economy. Do you think China wants to build up external debt? No, absolutely not. This is one of the key safekeepers, I guess, for China not to build up excessive debt. And more so, we're seeing the scrutiny of every single credit loan that goes out. So I think previously it's mainly been export loans, credit loans, etc. I think probably this year you're going to see that number drop back really quite a lot. Not only Chinese domestic commercial banks, but even the policy banks. The policy banks, China Development Bank, Exim Bank, etc. These are the banks that have really been, doing a lot of the debt financing, particularly in Africa. CDB in particular, the CAF, China Africa Fund, for example. But we have a very close dialogue with all of these policy banks, and they are absolutely thinking about, now we've got this amount of debt, let's keep the current level and think about how to manage the current risks we're facing.
Okay. Let's stop there. Another question from the iPad, and this is to the ambassador and to Dr. Yoon. What are your thoughts on China's railway developments in East Africa with regard to improving intra-regional trade? So we're back to the kind of, the East Africa or the more broadly the continental free trade.
Yeah, as I said, it is in line with the regional initiatives before China came with BRI. It was in 2012 that the leadership of the three countries, Kenya, Ethiopia, and South Sudan, that did in Nairobi, in my presence, initiate the project from Lamu to South Sudan, Ethiopia, through Kenya and Uganda. And this, we were very happy when China came up with the idea of financing this project. And Djibouti, Addis Ababa road, railway, it was aging, more than 100 years, and the gauge is not standard, and it was almost dysfunctional. Then China came with this idea, and we electrified it. Standard gauge was put in place, and the Addis Ababa Djibouti railway is the same standard with Mombasa Nairobi project.
Right.
So when this gets connected, very simply can be done. And China appreciates always 2 and above plus countries coming together in seeking finance to the project. So it does go together. Now we are okay.
No, we've got time probably for one more lady here.
You're painting a very benign picture of risk around the Belt and Road, particularly political risk. And I might want to suggest that the risk is not only about debt sustainability or commercial contracts, but also about the soft influence that China is planting across Africa. And I was wondering if someone would like to comment on whether it's all absolute marvellous and we've got nothing to worry about, or whether we should be slightly more critical.
A bit naive. Surely China has an agenda here. Yeah. Linda.
This is a tricky question. Each country, lending to other countries or doing foreign aid or whatever, of course they want to create, friendships and good linkages with other countries. No one does it just out of kindness, really. It's because you want to build your place in the world and you want to sort of build good relationship with other countries that will potentially, be on your side on some issues. I think, yes, this is pretty much sort of standard and normal. So I don't see anything that China is doing that other countries are not doing.
Yeah, this is a good one for you. I mean, you can't just assume that China's in it just for.
My sister, we are not naive. China is coming with its agenda because there is no free lunch. And it is up to us to maximize out of it and negotiate better what we receive. And that's what we are doing in Ethiopia. Whatever comes, if it is not in our liking, we have the audacity to say no. And we make it, and every government is acting like that? I'm not sure. All right?
So you said that China has its agenda.
Of course.
Could you put that into words? What is its agenda?
I mean, global. China, look, in 3-4 decades, it came to be a second economy in the world. All right? It used to tell us, until very recently, they belong to group of 77.
Yeah.
And we are telling them, we are growing. No, we are not growing. We are third world. And then suddenly, the fact has come that they are industrialized, a second economy. They are competing with the United States to become the first economy in the world. And they have to have the muscle to do it. And that must be the final objective. If I'm a Chinese government advisor, I would have advised the same way as I'm advising my government to maximize our interest.
Yes.
So there is a global play, there is economic interest, and security, maritime interest, everything. Then they have to do it.
What about votes at the UN? I mean, does the check come with an understanding that you vote with?
UN?
Yeah, China.
No. UN itself is in trouble. Is in trouble. Yes, multilateral, thanks to some of the leaders from the bigger countries. So let me not get into that. But UN is a free club to all of us that belongs to 192 countries, and we play it all there. We are equal in the same. But this thing is bilateral, what we are doing with China, although it is multilateral with specific countries, when it comes together, multilateral. But it is based on individual countries with China.
I was just going to say, I think we can't forget the history of China's engagement with Africa. And I think if we go back to the 1950s and 1960s, it was very much about Chinese solidarity with anti-imperialist kind of movement, right? And I think China's recent experience of growth is something that they want to share. So I think it's very difficult for many of us who are based in the West, who are Western, to see things through their eyes. But for the first, 20, 30 years of engagement between China and Africa, it was about solidarity. It was about a kind of mutual struggle. China constantly harped on the fact that Zheng He, arrived in Africa to the shores and traded and then left. They never colonized, right? That's very huge in terms of the way that China frames its engagement with Africa. And the fact that Chinese laborers, workers, indentured workers were sent to Africa to help build roads and railways and ports is also a very important part of China's narrative in terms of how they frame their understanding. And I think even though today we're talking about win-win and mutual benefit and things like that in terms of China's narrative, I think that history plays a continued role in their kind of attitude or tone with Africa. I think the other thing that you did mention was the UN, but more broadly speaking, Africa is a continent of 54 countries. It's been said before. I'm going to say it again. 54 countries, a quarter of all of the votes in the UN, but also an entire continent that is ripe, right, and ready to be developed. And that is a market that China is looking at. So if we look toward the future, it's a market. I mean, that is in their interest. And again, I think the kind of third point is, as China gets comfortable with its role as a global leader, second, like almost first economy, I think its relationship and how it does things matters. And this learning curve that Linda mentioned, I think is very much a part of the way in which China's been learning by stepping on the stones, right? I mean, this is not a done deal. Everything has been shifting really rapidly, and those of us who've been looking at China-African engagement for the last 15 or 20 years have seen all of these shifts.
This is evolving, yeah. We're meant to be wrapping up, but there was an insistent hand shot up here, so so very briefly.
Due to the limited time, I just have one short comment and one short question. The comment is that the Belt and Road Initiative, it was come up by China, by President Xi, but this initiative belongs to the world. This is the short comment. And I would say another comment, is that one of the audiences asked describe the participant of the BRO as the client state. I don't believe this is the right word to describe the participants of the Belt and Road Initiative. Take an example. If UK would like to cooperate with China on the climate change issue, for some time later, maybe there will be a deep cooperation between the two countries. Do you think it is the right way to describe UK as a client state of China? I don't believe so. Finally, I have a short question, not only to the panelists, but to all the audience here today. Why criticism on the Belt and Road Initiative are not coming from participants, not coming from African countries, but coming from outside these initiatives? I think everybody here should think about it after this conference.
Okay. Well, that's what you call a loaded question. In that there was an assumption in the question, so I'm going to slightly turn it around. I mean, is that true? Are all African countries very happy with the way everything's going, or do some complain, or is this just whipped up by troublemakers like me in the press? We have about a minute each to go around to answer that question.
Quick answer. I think Council of Foreign Relations actually did a survey. I think probably about 67%, something like that, respondents in Africa are saying that they're quite positive.
Right, that's 37.
But it depends on whether you're asking government officials or whether you're actually asking the people. So that's the key. If you're asking people on the streets, they're like, well, how's it impact on me? If it's giving me a job, great. If it's not doing that for me, then I don't care really.
Okay.
I would agree. I think for most Africans, Belt and Road doesn't affect them. I mean, it's not a kind of something that they're going to benefit from or suffer from, one or another.
But the policymakers themselves, the officials, I mean, are they largely happy with the way things are going?
Again, if we go back to, what kind of infrastructure is being funded and the fact that these loans are being requested from these government and other elites in African countries, then yes, these are projects that they wanted funded. China is helping to fund them.
Linda? And I'm going to give the final word to the ambassador.
Sure. In the countries where I work, I think, yes, there's some criticism coming from these countries in Africa to the Belt and Road, but overall net positive, I would say.
Net positive, yeah.
Let me say this. African leaders receiving advice from the ministers. One of them asked to his leader, look, if an American ambassador comes to you, a German ambassador comes to you, UK ambassador comes to you, they will advise you how to protect human rights, including gay rights. But a Chinese ambassador comes, he will ask you, which road do you want me to build? Which one do you choose? The answer is yours. Period. That's as much as this we are happy.
Can I say no one's given the very obvious answer to the question?
You can.
The biggest answer is that the politicians are getting rich off these deals. Going to any of them, Uganda, the Kenya Railways, they make the money coming and going on pre-buying the land before the railroad, consulting fees.
Yeah, I mean the ambassador did mention corruption, and Linda mentioned a road that didn't have an obvious economic return. So, but I think that's a valid point.
But that's why China had the issue itself, right? That's why corruption campaign is absolutely at the heart of current legitimacy of China's political system, is the fight against corruption. And if the Belt and Road could help China to almost portray this picture that corruption is a very fundamental focal point of any developing country, in particular when it comes to infrastructure, then that's probably a success story for China. But at the moment, obviously, there's not enough governance in place. And if you're talking about international governance stepping in to monitor, it's not about how projects are negotiated, struck, whatever. What is the monitoring being done on how to ensure the projects are not just agreed, paid for, but actually are being monitored at every step of the way? Who's doing that? And it's not just Belt and Road, it's global infrastructure. How do you ensure global infrastructure is being risk managed and monitored properly?
But in that sense, he's right. I mean, China says we don't interfere, and then you have governments in many African countries that are pretty much unaccountable. So I mean, there is certainly a potential.
The blame goes to us. It is us to be blamed.
By the guy on the street.
Yes.
Which is where civil society comes in. But anyway, I think we've just, not gone off track, but we've raised a whole other issue there. But I think we have gone over time, so I'm going to thank our audience, thank our cyber audience, and most of all, thank our excellent, lively panel. Thank you.